All right, guys, welcome back to the last video in the series. This is video number 8 in the series, and this is the final video before the aircraft goes off to paint. The big one in this is we are doing all of our joints where our surfaces and hatches and everything contact our fuselage. That's where we're starting off with. We're doing all the finishing touches before paint in this episode. So let's dive in to the BVM Super Bandit and wrap this thing up. Okay, so we'll start off with our surfaces back here. And the reason we're going to start off with these guys is just because they're smaller, easier to deal with, and then we'll move into some of our bigger surfaces. So let's start off with our rudder first because it's the easiest to access. I'm going to gather the parts up and we'll get this thing underway. Okay, so basically when you're doing the joints here, it's a couple of very basic things. Number one, you are putting aero epoxy on one side of your joint, whatever it might be. So in the case of something like the wing here or the rudder, we're generally going to add our aero epoxy to the surface side would be my suggestion. So we're going to put our release tape on this side, on the fuselage side. We are going to make sure we roughen up the surface side so that the glue will stick very nicely to this. And that's really what it is. So we need our surfaces, we need to decide which side we're doing, we need release tape, and we need our product, so our aero epoxy. Okay, so if you look at our joint here from our vertical stab to our fuselage, it's actually a really good joint. The spacing, as we talked about during the build's a little bit funky, but altogether it's not terrible compared to something like our elevators. This side's a little bit worse, but still respectable. Now we've got a couple chips from manufacturing at the front edge here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to, number one, clean up this surface, which I've done already previously. So I've wiped this down with alcohol, and we're going to put some release tape on this side. Now the release tape that we're using, I don't know where it comes from. This came from my friend Kelly. Thank you, Kelly, for this material. This is like Teflon tape, but there's the interior side. If anybody knows where this stuff comes from, I would love to find some more of this stuff because this is all I've got. But so we're going to put this release tape on the fuselage side. Now on the surface side, this is still shiny, so we need to roughen up the edges a little bit. But I'm also going to sand the little chips and everything right here, so they will at least fill with high sol, and that might be good enough once we sand this out. But we'll see. So this is one of those areas where after the joints are all done here, so tomorrow we will come back and deal with all of our little spots like that. All right, so we've taped off our receiving portion. We've sanded down the perimeter of the rudder surface. So just made sure we roughened up everything. And we've mixed up some high sol. Now in this case, just like normal, I've added a little bit of heat to the high sol to make it a little bit more runny. Okay, so what we're gonna do now is we're gonna put a little bit of high sol on the actual receiving portion of the fuselage. So we're gonna keep it close to the edge because that's really the only area that we want to make sure we deal with. And we don't want any of it going into the holes and causing issues. So we'll keep that fairly light. Now, of course, you could use a nozzle if you want. I prefer not to, but you can use your finger, whatever works for you. And you can kind of look beforehand and figure out the areas that were maybe had a little bit more space, the areas that needed more material. Now the goal for this when we do it is we want the high sol to ooze out. And if we don't see it oozing out, then we can take our finger and we can get some installed. You probably hear in the background the Bamboo Labs printer doing its thing. It's pretty cool just to have that thing running in the background, printing stuff. And of course, as we work the rudder onto the surface here, we can clean up any that spills over with just use rubbing alcohol, and that should work perfect. Okay, so I'm going to pull the tail cone off here, just so that doesn't interfere with anything. Just add a bit of space there. Okay, so we've got our high sol all installed. Let's install our surface. I'm going to make sure I've got the right Allen key to do up the fasteners. Just taking some pictures for our chat on this one. Okay, so I'm just going to sink that down. Give it a bit of a wiggle side to side. And then first thing I'm going to do is fasten down the front holding piece, because that's going to add the most amount of tension to this. There we go. So as soon as we tighten that down, the high sol oozes out of there very nicely. So we'll snug that down, and then now we'll fasten down our back end. Beautiful. All right, so as a final step here, what we do is we just take the high sol that's gooped out and run our finger along it, and now we just leave that to cure. So we're going to do the elevators next here. This right elevator, if you have been following the build, you know that it's got a big gap on the top side here. So we are going to make sure we get plenty of high sol in that area, but we're also doing the elevators without the tail cone on, and we are going to be doing the metal part of the tail cone in this video too. So let's prep off the elevator here next. All right, so our tail is all complete. The horizontal stabs, vertical stabs have all been taped, glued, and bolted in place. So those are good. Next thing we're doing is moving on to the wings. So what I've done here is obviously laid the fuselage on its side. We have two balls supporting it on that side, and I'm just taking a look now at what our joint is going to end up looking like. So now we'll pull this apart, we'll sand down the root of the wing, and we will put our tape on the fuselage side. Now I'll just make a mark here. Not that it really matters, but this just tells me how far the actual wing's sitting in there. All right, so both wings are done. We were able to do this wing here, both sides, because we had the plane on this end, right? This other wing, we just flipped the plane upside down to allow good access to this. So I tried to fill this as much as possible. So obviously when we're done, the goal here, what's gonna happen is we're gonna pull the wing off. It's gonna separate from the Teflon tape that is on the fuselage side, and then our tape should pull up with pretty much all of the epoxy except the areas we've got some overrun here. Now, because that's not going to stick to the primer very well, that should come off nice and easy. And then the goal is to get rid of a little bit of the high sol that's on the wings, because we don't have tape on the wings, so we've got some overrun here. So we'll use our probably our plane, get rid of as much of that as possible, and then give the edges or the joints a nice sand. So there's a shot of the horizontal stabs. This should turn out awesome. Okay, so we're gonna flip the plane back over, and then we're gonna take a look at the canopies and see if there's anything we need to do on the canopy or hatches. Okay, so we've got our airplane flipped over, and we are going to work on the canopy and hatch now. So what we'll do is treat this exactly the same way. We're going to tape off our fuselage, and we are going to epoxy our hatch. That's the plan here, and obviously the goal is to make this stuff completely disappear as much as possible with these joints. All right, so front canopy is next. We ended up using a nozzle on this one just because we needed to lay down a nice solid bead on the fuselage. So I don't think you'll be able to see it except if you look right there, but we've got our tape on the fuselage. So if you look at the canopy, we've got the wood to fiberglass joint, and that is ideally where our glue is going to grab onto. So this is going to be a little bit precarious, but we're going to set this down as nicely as possible, jam it forward, and get that canopy edge dealt with nicely. All right, so it is the next day, and I just popped this elevator loose here. So it is pretty cool how this all works. So what happens is I just undo the fixing bolts, give the elevators a bit of just a little tap here. So on this one, for example, I haven't loosened the fixing bolts yet, but we loosen the fixing bolts, give the elevator a bit of a, kind of a huh, and that's the technical term. You just give it a huh. And what happens is it pops it off the Teflon tape. It's pretty cool how this stuff works. Again, thank you, Kelly. This is awesome. And so then what happens, you pull the surface off and you are left with this. So it gives you a really good idea of what we actually did here. And you can see, especially at the front, all the different fills and everything about how this actually worked. So all we need to do now is basically take our plane and get rid of this material right here, and we will have a beautiful fuselage to surface joint. So the reason I'm taking the elevators off is I didn't do the tail cone yet, and we didn't do the main hatch yet. So I'm getting the elevators off so we can work on those, and then once the tail cone and hatch are done right now, then we'll do the other surfaces, but we got to get these guys going and glued so we're not held up by them. All right, so I didn't show you guys any of this process because it was exactly the same as doing all of our surfaces, but we've got the tail cone in place, screwed in place. Our high sol is all curing, so that's good. And our hatch here is also in place. The hatch is pretty much just like the wings, so we've got a good contact surface on the front and sides. The back is just a little fiberglass slice like we've seen on other areas, like we were talking about on the front of the hatch. But we're going to let that stuff cure now, and it's going to take a little bit. Now in this case, what I did was on this hatch and the tail cone, I used 20-minute high sol. So typically we're using 9462 high sol, which is kind of the norm, the standard. But for these two hatches, we used EAE 20 HP. So this is a 2-to-1 application. So the white side is 2 parts, the kind of clear side is 1 part. When we couldn't find 9462 last year or earlier this year, this is what I was using, and this stuff is actually really good. I like it. It does kick off quite a bit quicker though, so it starts to firm up in about 15 minutes. So you got a little bit lower work time, but it does cure quicker. So in a couple hours, we'll be able to come back and deal with these, the tail cone and the hatch. All right, guys, so just working on one of the wings here. We haven't done the left wing, we've done the right wing. I'm just doing some final adjustments, but there is an example of what you're looking for on the joint. So those joints are beautiful. Now those little dark areas you see right there, those are areas on the fuselage that we need to use fiberglass putty on to fill, because those, when they pulled them out of the molds, those were little imperfections. But as far as the wing goes right now, just amazing. That looks awesome. So just doing some final sanding on the root of the wing here. I'm just doing this portion while it's on the fuselage, just to get a nice fit, rather than just guessing when the wing's off the fuselage. Looks great. Very happy with this so far. We're still waiting on the main hatch and the tail cone to cure, but next wing we'll do is obviously the left wing. All right, guys, so we have our rudder, elevators, vertical, horizontal stab, our bottom hatch, right wing, left wing, all on the table. So those have all been done and completed. You'll see the tape on each of the surfaces. So this one, as an example, we have to just treat our glue holes that's the final thing to do on the surface. So we've gone through and laid all that stuff out. So what we'll do now is we're going to mix up some polyester filler. We're going to take care of those quick little touch-ups, and then chances are, I think, we are going to be moving on to the fuselage, so the cone and the hatches, prepping off of those surfaces. All right, so we've got the tail cone all done now. Quite a bit of sanding on this one to make sure it's nice and even. We do have some areas to fill on the right-hand side, so I've just taken my black Sharpie and marked those out with dots. So there's not much to do, but we just, it'd be a nice finish if we get those little areas finished. We've also got an area on the bottom to fill with polyester filler. We're going to do this area as well. So we've sanded this down nicely by hand, and we'll just make sure we fill that area in with polyester filler, so then we can sand it out and it'll be nice and smooth and you won't see that joint between the two items. So tail cone is sanded out. We're not going to do our metal thing yet. We're going to move on to our hatch. So same thing we've been doing. The high saw that's around the perimeter of the hatch and the front cockpit area. All right, so the main canopy hatch area is all complete. We did a bunch of fitting and sanding there, and plane's upside down obviously right now, but it looks really good. Now, one of the things we did was we sanded down the mating side a little bit, just a little bit with 220 sandpaper. You want to make sure you leave a little bit of a gap there, like a paper width gap for when the paint gets done. So there's no interference, but we flipped the fuselage over, just inspecting the underside. One of the big things we got to do next is the intakes. So we've got a bunch of extra high sol where we glued our intakes together. So fortunately we can take our plane or our X-Acto knife and we'll be able to get rid of most of that stuff. And then we can fill the intakes in there and sand those down and make them look beautiful. All right, so we've got the fuselage pretty much ready to go. We sanded out the intakes as well too. They were quite a mess, but we used a Dremel and just sanded those out. Now we'll put some polyester filler in the intakes. Also added the hole for the pitot tube when we put the plane together. So better to do that now so we're not chipping paint when we install it. And the other thing we do here is those little areas where you've got the mold release making little chips in the fuselage. I just take my Dremel and just do a little notch in those areas, and that gives our polyester filler somewhere more to stick to rather than just a tiny little sliver or speck. All right, guys, we're doing a live right now. So there's Katie, there's the live. We're like time warped here. So doing the live, we kind of completely, well, I shouldn't say we, I completely forget to share this stuff with you guys. So we took the tail cone off the plane. We're trying to mount the turkey feathers inside the tail cone. We'll just call this the tail cone. This is the turkey feathers. If I'm wrong, that's okay. So what we're doing here is I took the measurement, right to there is 65 millimeters. So we kept 55. Measured back 55 and kind of just came up with this angle and position. So that's what we ended up with. And the goal in all of this is to have the turkey feathers sticking out just a little bit. So we may cut this back a bit more, but we're gonna see. But the side angle here, I think what we're gonna do is kind of sneak that down a little bit at a bit of an angle. And I think we'll still be okay. If this is too flimsy back here, we can just add some more carbon back here, but it's not really supporting anything. Right now, it's just gonna be supporting the turkey feathers, so I don't think it's gonna be a big deal at all. But that's what we're looking for, and that looks really sharp. I think that is gonna be such a cool touch for this plane. This is awesome. All right, so there's the turkey feathers installed. We've got our line marked out for what we want our cutout to be. And there is one side cut out. I think it looks really good. So we're gonna do the same thing to that side. Okay guys, so we're not gonna mount the tail cone now at this point. We did just take the pipe. Now the pipe fits in here. It's got two tabs that sit against the tail cone structure. And when we have the turkey feathers sitting in here, the pipe sits perfectly flush. So it actually works out just great the way everything's spaced. So happy with that. But we're not going to mount this to the tail cone until after this comes back from paint. But at least this stage now, the cut and everything is done. All right, so everything is done on the fuselage. We finally got the intakes sanded out. Those intakes were brutal. They were a ton of work. Basically, I just used raw sandpaper, fabric sandpaper. So the back is fabric. You can fold it and wrinkle it up into a bunch of different shapes, and sheer manpower to sand those out. So intakes are done. Everything on the fuselage is sanded out. So we're just going through each surface now. We had the elevators, vertical stab to sand out. There's a shot of the tail cone. It's not mounted, it's just placed in there, but that looks wicked. And that's it. So we're going to put the hatches on. We are going to check over the wings one last time, and it looks like we are ready to send this girl off to paint. Well guys, that is the BVM Super Bandit wrapped up, ready for paint. Tomorrow this thing leaves for a 13-hour journey west to our painter, who will be starting on the paint for this beautiful aircraft. We are going with a red and black scheme. Unless you've watched The Lighter Side of RC After Dark, you do not know the details. Maybe you want to check out The Lighter Side of RC After Dark, where we talked about the details. But anyways, we do have a red and black scheme going on this aircraft. It's going to be absolutely awesome. Really excited to see all the joints and everything, how it all works out, and how they end up being invisible. So that's it for now. When you see this airplane next, we will have it back, painted, and we will start the assembly process. So that will be fun, looking forward to it. But until then, we will see ya in the next video.